The California Reparations Task Force delivered its final report at the end of June, which was over 1,000 pages. The task force attempted to analyze the legacy of slavery and other discrimination in both the state of California, which has been a free state always, and also nationwide.
And joining us now to discuss what the task force found and what they propose is the chair of the California Reparations Task Force, Kamilah Moore. Kamilah, great to have you with us here. What stuck out for you most in terms of the findings of this task force?
Sure. Thank you for having me. What stuck out to me the most was we identified over 12 major areas of systemic discrimination, or what the task force is defining as the lingering badges and incidents of slavery that still persist today and disproportionately impact descendants of enslaved people, where we actually identified key and specific areas of exclusionary public policy since California statehood to present that has abridged on the 14th Amendment rights, particularly of African Americans, from housing segregation, mass incarceration over policing, separate and unequal education, the wealth gap, and so on and so on. And so that's where those 115 policy recommendations are aimed to eradicate or end those lingering badges and incidents of slavery, or those major areas of systemic discrimination.
Affirmative action that occurred, I guess, from the 60s on, both in employment as well as in education, which we saw last week as the topic of the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago. What role do the efforts to remedy any past discrimination, what role does that play? And follow up on that thought, if you will.
Sure. No, that's a really great question. So as you all know, in California, race-based remedies have been illegal since 1996 via Proposition 209. So the task force actually enlisted legal experts like Dean of UC Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky, who pretty much predicted the outcome of the affirmative action case, pretty much told us over a year ago that the Supreme Court will strike down race-conscious admissions preferences. And so he suggested that instead of structuring our policy recommendations on the basis of race, which would run afoul of the California and U.S. Constitution, to structure our policies in a facially race-neutral fashion for descendants of slaves. So most of our policy recommendations are not actually race-based. They are for descendants of slaves in particular.
Kamilah, is there a certain number that was agreed upon by the task force that each Black American in California would potentially receive? And where would the money come from? Has that also been determined?
So, contrary to popular belief, the task force actually has not recommended any particular amounts. I know there's several different headlines going out there, some saying the task force has recommended every Black person to receive $1.2 million. That's not true. What the task force did, we actually hired 5 economists and public policy experts to help us calculate the monetary losses of the African American community over time since statehood across 5 harm areas: housing segregation, separate and unequal education, mass incarceration over policing, unjust property takings, and devaluation of Black businesses. And what they found was the average 71-year-old African American has lost over $1.2 million over their lifetime due to exclusionary public policy, due to the actual data and evidence that they could find where the state of California was particularly culpable in.
Okay,
so now it's up to...
We only have so much time. Just want to move a little more down the road on it. Where does the money come from for any programs that you might want to implement or any reparations you might want to pay? And how would it just be tax dollars in the state of California? Would it just be white people who had some connection to slavery in California? I don't know how that all comes out, but money doesn't grow, doesn't grow on trees. So the idea that you have here, even if supported, how would they be paid for?
Yeah, so the task force has been pretty clear that this effort is not about individual guilt. It's not about making white people feel guilty. This is a conversation around state responsibility. and our recommendations are framed in that way. It's not to be punitive in nature to any group, but that's up to the legislature now to decide, to read our final report with an open heart and mind, and start having conversations amongst themselves around how to implement our recommendations, including the cash payments. But we have.
Do you account for any discrimination against Hispanics, for instance, who have typically had a larger part of the population in California? And again, to underscore, California itself didn't have slavery of African Americans. Correct me if I'm wrong there. Are other people who suffered discrimination, are they accounted for?
So the 1,100-page final report does include the history of all Californians, including Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latino Americans, and to the extent that they want to also, work for reparatory justice, those communities can do that. Just to correct the record, there was slavery in California. We enlisted academics to prove that fact. There were over 2,000 enslaved Black people in the state. Also, the state implemented a fugitive slave law. So California was not a sanctuary state in any sense. If you were a runaway slave and came to California, you could be deported to be re-enslaved in the South or enslaved in California. And all of that history is in our final report as well.
Yeah. How much of this is based on someone's economic position? There are many people who happen to be Anglo who have not had advantages that you might describe people having simply because they are of another race. How is that accounted for? In other words, how much of the discrimination someone has suffered in the past, assuming there was some, was based on class, social position, rather than color?
Well, when we're talking about descendants of slaves, we're talking about a caste system.
So you have a way to track that? Do you have a way to track who's a descendant of a slave?
Yes, we have a way to track that. It's in the data produced in our 1,100-page report. Also, one of the recommendations is to create a new state agency called the Freedmen Affairs Agency, in light of the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed in this country. Board certified genealogists would be working at that agency to be able to better track who is a descendant of slave as well.
So Kamilah, so then would it mean that only descendants of slaves, only Black Americans in California who are descendants of slaves versus all Black Americans in California, only descendants of slaves would receive reparations?
Yes, so only descendants of slaves would receive cash payments in the form of installments, so no lump sum payments, and the elderly would be prioritized. But there are, of those 115 policy recommendations, some recommendations that would benefit all Black people and actually all Californians, regardless of race.
But you don't have you don't have the responsibility of coming up where that money would come from.
The state task force, by law, via the statute that created the task force, was not enlisted with that responsibility. We've talked about it in previous hearings, but that's not what we produce in the final report.
Fair enough.
All right, Kamilah Moore, thanks so much for explaining all of this to us. We really appreciate your firsthand account. Thank you.
Thank you.